My name's Sarah Mackenzie, and this here's the hardest story I've ever had to tell, but it's also the most important one. I grew up in the rolling hills of Athens County, Ohio, where the oak and maple forests stretch as far as the eye can see, and where everybody's known everybody for 3 generations running. It was 1995, and I was 9 years old when my brother Michael came into this world. I remember clear as day when Mom and Dad brought him home from the hospital to our blue clapboard house on Depot Street, just 2 blocks down from the elementary school. Michael was a perfect baby. Curly brown hair, bright green eyes just like Dad's, and a smile that could light up the whole room. "Sarah, you're gonna be the best big sister in all of Ohio," Mom would say, letting me hold Michael while she rested on the living room sofa. Our house always smelled like apple pie and coffee, especially on Sundays after Methodist service. Michael hit all his milestones right on time, don't you know? At 6 months, he was sitting up all by himself. At 9 months, he was crawling around the house like a little explorer, always chasing after our cat, Whiskers. At 12 months, he took his first wobbly steps straight into my arms. "Soa, Soa" were his first words at 15 months. He couldn't get Sarah quite right, but to me it was the prettiest sound in all creation. I went running to tell Mom, who was cooking in our little yellow kitchen. Michael talked. He said my name. Mom dropped her wooden spoon and came running. "Where? What did he say?" "Sawa." He said, "Sawa." Michael was sitting on the living room floor, playing with his colored wooden blocks, a gift from Grandma Henderson, who lived clear across town. From that day on, Michael wouldn't quit talking. By age 2, he had a vocabulary that'd knock your socks off. "Mama, I want banana," he'd say clear as a bell during breakfast. "Daddy, work?" he'd ask when our father, Tom Mackenzie, headed off for his shift at the local brick plant. By age 3, Michael was a chatty, loving little boy. Every morning, he'd come running into my room, hop right up on my bed and say, "Good morning, Sawa, let's play." We'd build pillow forts, play school, and he always insisted on being my helper when I'd do homework at the kitchen table. "How come you write so much?" he'd ask, climbing up on the chair beside me. "'Cause when you get bigger, you're gonna learn to write pretty words too," I'd tell him, and he'd beam with pride. Michael was crazy about books. Every night before bed, Dad would sit in the rocking chair between our beds and read stories. Michael knew every book by heart. "Goodnight Moon," "Where the Wild Things Are," "The Cat in the Hat." He'd repeat the lines right along with Dad, turning pages at just the right moment. "Someday, I'm gonna read to you, Daddy," Michael said one night when he was 4. "I know you will, champ," Dad replied, kissing his forehead. During summers, we'd take Michael fishing at Burr Oak Lake, about 20 minutes from home. He'd get all worked up about the fish and always ask, "How come they live in the water, Sarah?" I'd try to explain with my kid words, and he'd listen with complete attention, like I was the smartest person in the whole wide world. Michael was also something else when it came to being loving. Every time I got down in the dumps, maybe 'cause the girls at school had been mean, or I'd gotten a bad grade, he'd come over with his little arms wide open. "Sarah sad?" he'd ask, tilting his head to the side. "A little bit," I'd admit. Then he'd hug me tight and say, "Michael loves Sarah so much. So much." Those hugs could fix just about anything. Looking back now, I can see there were some little signs that our family didn't pick up on. Michael had his quirks. He insisted on lining up his toy cars in perfect rows before bedtime. If anybody messed with them, he'd get all worked up until he could arrange them just how he wanted. He also had his routines down pat. Breakfast always in the same chair. always Cheerios, cereal, always in the same blue bowl. Any change to that routine would make him uncomfortable, but we figured it was just a cute kid thing. When Michael turned 5, he started kindergarten at Athens Elementary. His teacher, Mrs. Patterson, told us he was a sweet, smart boy, but sometimes had trouble playing with other kids. He likes to play by himself, she explained to Mom during a conference. Nothing to worry about. Some boys are just more on the quiet side. During that first school year, Michael was still the same loving boy at home. He'd help me feed Whiskers, tell us about his day at supper, and always asked me to read him stories before bed. "Sarah reads better than anybody," he'd announce proudly when we had company over. That fall, when the trees in Athens County turned gold and red, Michael and I spent hours collecting the prettiest leaves to make collages. He knew all the tree names: oak, maple, hickory, and always wondered why the leaves changed colors. "It's autumn magic," I'd tell him, and he'd accept that explanation with a bright smile. If somebody had told me back then that in a few years Michael would lose his ability to speak, to recognize me clearly, to show affection the way we knew it, I never would have believed it. That 5-year-old boy, with his bright eyes and warm hugs, seemed to have the whole world ahead of him. If this story's touching your heart like it's touching mine to tell it, please hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Share in the comments if you or someone you know lives a similar experience with autism. Let's build a community of support and understanding, 'cause nobody should have to walk this road alone. Michael turned 8 in March of 2003, and it was around that time we started noticing little changes. At first, they were small things we chalked up to normal growing up. The first thing I noticed was that Michael quit seeking me out every morning. Before, he'd always come running to my room soon as he woke up, jumping on my bed with his "good morning, Sawa." But all of a sudden, he started staying in his room longer, sometimes until Mom had to holler for him several times to come to breakfast. "Michael, come eat." Mom would call from the kitchen. "Nothing, Michael." Finally, he'd show up, but without the energy and excitement from before. He'd sit at the table, eat his Cheerios, quiet as you please, and when I tried talking to him, his answers got shorter and shorter. "How was school yesterday?" I'd ask. "Good," he'd say, not even looking at me. "What did you learn?" "Stuff." That was about all the conversation we'd get out of him in the mornings now. At school, things were getting worse. Mrs. Patterson had retired, and Michael was now in 2nd grade with Mrs. Coleman, an experienced teacher who'd been at Athens Elementary for more than 20 years. Come November that year, she called the house asking for a meeting with my folks. I wasn't part of the conversation, but I heard bits and pieces through the school office door. "Michael's behavior has changed something fierce since the beginning of the school year," Mrs. Coleman was explaining. "He's having trouble focusing, doesn't respond when I call his name. And he's had some meltdowns when we changed the classroom routine." Mom, who worked part-time at the Athens Public Library, asked, "What kind of meltdowns?" "Last week, when we had to cancel recess on account of the rain, Michael hollered and threw his school supplies all over the floor. Took a good 15 minutes to get him settled down. And yesterday, when a classmate borrowed his pencil without asking, Michael gave him a hard shove." Dad, always practical and talking, a trait common to men in this neck of the woods who grew up working with their hands, tried to find quick fixes. "Maybe he just needs more discipline at home," he suggested. "Boys that age sometimes need clearer boundaries." But Mrs. Coleman shook her head. "Mr. Mackenzie, I've taught hundreds of children over the years. This isn't about discipline. Michael seems to be fighting something he can't control." When my parents came home that night, They looked worried. Mom spent longer than usual tidying the kitchen after supper, and Dad sat on the back porch smoking his evening cigarette longer than normal. Something he always did when he was chewing on serious problems. At home, the changes became more obvious during winter break. Michael, who'd always loved Christmas time, seemed completely uninterested when we put up the Christmas tree. A family tradition he'd always been wild about. Michael just sat on the couch watching us work, but didn't want to help. "Michael, don't you want to hang the ornaments?" Mom asked, holding out a box of decorations he'd made at school the year before. He looked at the box, then at Mom, and shook his head. "Don't want to." "But you always loved decorating the tree," I said, trying to encourage him. "Remember that star you made last year? The gold one with glitter?" Michael looked at me for a moment, and for a second I thought I'd see a flash of my old little brother. But then he just said, "Don't remember," and went back to staring at his hands. During Christmas dinner, at Grandma Henderson's, Michael barely interacted with our extended family. Grandma, who'd always been his favorite person after me, tried talking to him. "Michael, honey, tell me what you're learning in school," she said, sitting down next to him at the long dining room table. Michael chewed his food slow, like he hadn't heard the question. "Michael," Grandma tried again, gently touching his arm. He pulled away from her touch, something he'd never done before, and mumbled, "School's boring." Uncle Robert, Dad's brother who lived down in Cincinnati, made a joke. "Aw, every boy thinks school's boring at that age." I hated school when I was 8. But I knew Michael. He'd never complained about school before. In fact, he'd always talked excitedly about his teachers, his classmates, the books they were reading in class. The biggest change happened in January, right after we got back to school. Michael had always loved our nighttime reading routine. Dad would sit in the rocking chair between our beds, and we'd pick a book together. Michael always joined in, asking questions about the story, commenting on the pictures, sometimes even acting out scenes with his toys. But that January night, when Dad asked which book he wanted to read, Michael said something that chilled me to the bone. "Don't want stories." Dad looked surprised. "You sure? What about that new book about dinosaurs we got? You said you wanted to read about the T-Rex." "Dinosaurs are dumb," Michael replied, turning his back to us in bed. Dad and I exchanged confused looks. Michael had been obsessed with dinosaurs since he was 4. His room was full of dinosaur toys, dinosaur books, dinosaur posters. How could they have become dumb overnight? Over the next few weeks, I noticed more changes. Michael quit organizing his toy cars in perfect rows, something he'd done religiously every night for years. Matter of fact, he seemed to have lost interest in most of his toys. They just sat around his room, gathering dust. His talking skills were going backwards fast. Sentences that used to be complex and full of curiosity became simple and to the point. "Michael, what do you want for lunch?" Mom would ask. "Sandwich," he'd answer. "What kind of sandwich?" "Don't know. Peanut butter, ham, cheese." "Don't matter." That "don't matter" became his standard answer to just about everything. What clothes to wear? Don't matter. What TV show to watch? Don't matter. What game to play? Don't matter. The curious, chatty, loving Michael was disappearing right before our eyes, and none of us knew why. In February, we had another worrying incident. Michael had always been gentle with Whiskers, our cat. He'd feed him, play gently with him, and sometimes even talk to Whiskers like he was his best friend. But that afternoon, I heard Whiskers making a strange sound from Michael's room. When I went in to see what was going on, I found Michael holding Whiskers in a stiff, uncomfortable way. squeezing him against his chest while the cat was trying to get loose. "Michael, you're hurting Whiskers," I said calmly, walking closer. He looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Empty, like he didn't quite recognize me. "He won't play with me," Michael said, but he didn't let go of the cat. "Sometimes, cats don't want to play, and that's okay. You can play with him later." I gently touched Michael's arm to encourage him to let Whiskers go, and he finally did. But the way he'd been holding the cat, the look on his face, the apparent lack of empathy for Whiskers' situation, all of it was new and troubling. That night, I mentioned the incident to Mom while we washed dishes together. "Mom, do you think Michael's okay?" She stopped drying the plate in her hands and looked at me. "What do you mean, honey?" "He's different. Doesn't talk to me like before. Doesn't play the same way. And today, he was being kind of rough with Whiskers." Mom sighed deeply. "I've been noticing too, Sarah. Dad and I are trying to decide if we should take him to the doctor." "You think he's sick?" "I don't know, honey. Sometimes kids go through rough patches. Maybe it's just a phase." But deep down in my 13-year-old heart, I knew it wasn't just a phase. The Michael I knew and loved was pulling away from us, and I didn't know how to bring him back. The last clear memory I have of the old Michael was in March, on his 9th birthday. Mom had made his favorite cake, chocolate with vanilla frosting, and the whole family was gathered in our living room for the little party. When it came time to blow out the candles, we all sang happy birthday like we always did. Michael stood in front of the cake, looking at the 9 little candles, but he didn't blow them out. "Make a wish, champ," Dad said, smiling. Michael looked around the room at each of us, like he was trying to remember something important. For a moment, his eyes met mine, and I saw a flash of my real little brother. Confused, maybe a little scared. "I don't know what to wish for," he said quietly. Those were the last complex, emotionally aware words I heard Michael say for a very, very long time. To understand what was happening to Michael, I need to pause this story for a spell and explain something that took me years to figure out: how regressive autism works in the brain. When Michael was born, his brain was developing in what seemed like a typical way. During the first years of life, the human brain goes through a period of explosive growth. New neural connections, called synapses, form at an incredible speed. It's like the brain is a city under construction, with new roads being built every minute. In the first 2 years of life, a child's brain has nearly twice as many synapses as it will have in adulthood. That's why babies and little kids are like tiny sponges, soaking up information, learning language, developing social skills at a pace that we adults find downright impossible to keep up with. Michael was navigating this developmental period just fine. He learned to talk, to interact socially, to show empathy, to play imaginatively. All these skills showed that the right areas of his brain were connecting properly. But then something changed. Between ages 6 and 9, the brain goes through a process called synaptic pruning. Imagine the brain decides to do a major cleanup in that neural city it built. Connections that aren't used frequently get eliminated to make the system more efficient. It's like tearing down unnecessary roads so traffic can flow better on the main routes. In most children, this pruning process strengthens the most important skills and only eliminates connections that really aren't needed. But in children with regressive autism, something goes haywire during this pruning. Dr. Martha Herbert, a neurologist at Massachusetts General Hospital, explained it in a way that finally made sense to me. Imagine the brain is trying to optimize its connections, but the navigation system is busted. Instead of just eliminating the unnecessary routes, it accidentally destroys some of the main highways. In Michael's case, the neural connections responsible for language, social communication, and emotional regulation got affected during this process. It's not that he lost these abilities in the traditional sense. It's more like the routes to access them got damaged or blocked. Research by Dr. Eric Korshin at the University of California showed that children with regressive autism often show atypical brain growth. During the first 2 years, the brain grows faster than normal. Then, during the critical period of 6 to 9 years, it can't organize itself efficiently. Factors that might contribute to regressive autism include genetics. Michael was probably born with a genetic predisposition that made him vulnerable to regressive autism. It's not one specific gene, but rather a combination of multiple genetic variations that affect brain development. Hormones. During early puberty, hormonal changes can trigger or speed up atypical neurological processes. Michael's brain was trying to navigate not just normal synaptic pruning, but also the first signs of hormonal changes. Oxidative stress. Some researchers believe that the brains of children with autism may have trouble processing oxidative stress. Basically, layers of cellular toxins that build up during normal development. Environmental factors. There's no evidence that vaccines cause autism, but factors like infections, exposure to certain toxins, or traumatic events could potentially trigger regression in genetically predisposed children. What happened to Michael was likely a perfect storm of genetic vulnerability and developmental timing. His brain was trying to reorganize its connections during a critical period, but the process went off the rails. Dr. Geraldine Dawson, an autism specialist at Duke University, uses an analogy that helped me a lot. Think of brain development like an orchestra rehearsing a complex symphony. During the early years, all the musicians are learning their parts and how to play together. Michael was like a talented young violinist who was playing beautifully with the rest of the orchestra. But then, during the refinement period, when the orchestra should have been polishing its performance, some of the musicians started playing in different keys. It's not that they lost their ability to play. It's that they can't synchronize with the rest of the group anymore. The brain areas responsible for language, mainly Broca's and Wernicke's areas, seemed to be especially affected in Michael. He didn't completely lose the ability to understand or produce language, but the connections became less efficient, less fluid. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for executive functions like planning, impulse control, and emotional regulation, also showed changes. This explained why Michael started having trouble with transitions, why he got more agitated with changes in routine, and why his frustration episodes became more intense and harder to control. The brain regions associated with social processing, including the fusiform gyrus and amygdala, were also affected. This explained why Michael was losing interest in social interactions, why he stopped seeking hugs and emotional connection, and why he seemed not to fully recognize the people around him. It's important to understand that regressive autism isn't deterioration in the traditional sense. Michael's brain wasn't dying or degenerating. Instead, it was reorganizing its connections in an atypical way, creating new patterns of functioning that were different from those we'd known during his early years. Some research suggests that the autistic brain may actually be hyperconnected in certain areas, which might explain why people with autism often have specialized abilities or are extremely sensitive to sensory stimuli. The problem isn't necessarily the number of connections, but how they're organized and how they communicate with each other. Dr. Jutta Frith, a renowned researcher at University College London, explains, "The autistic brain isn't a broken brain, It's a brain that processes information differently. It's like having a computer with a unique operating system. It can do amazing things, but it needs different interfaces to communicate with other systems. For our family in Athens County, of course, we didn't know any of this at the time. All we saw was the Michael we knew and loved becoming more and more distant, harder to reach. We didn't understand that his brain was going through a fundamental reorganization that would take years to stabilize. What I wish we'd known then was that, even during this period of dramatic change, Michael was still in there. His memories from the early years didn't disappear. His love for us didn't disappear. His fundamental personality didn't disappear. They just became harder to access. Like books stored in a library, whose cataloging system had been reorganized in a way we were still learning to navigate. The years between Michael's 9th and 20th birthdays were like watching a storm gather slowly on the horizon and then slam into our family with full force. In 2005, when Michael was 10, the changes we'd noticed got a whole lot worse. The first time Michael had a truly violent episode was in April that year. I was 19, and in my first year at Ohio University, but I'd come home for the weekend. It was a quiet spring Saturday, and Mom was trying to get Michael to take a bath, something that had become a daily battle. "Michael, honey, you need to take a bath before supper," Mom said patiently. She'd learned to use a calm, steady tone with him, but I could see the exhaustion in her eyes. "No," Michael replied, not looking up from the living room floor where he was sitting, rocking back and forth, a behavior that had started recently. "Michael, you took a bath yesterday, so today's the day. Remember our talk about routine?" No. The explosion was so sudden and loud that everyone in the house froze. Michael jumped up quick and started screaming. Not words, just raw sounds of frustration. Dad came running from the kitchen. "What's going on?" Before anyone could answer, Michael grabbed the lamp from the side table and threw it against the wall. The sound of glass shattering echoed through our little living room. Then he started banging his head against the wall, over and over, hard enough to leave marks on the paint. "Michael, stop," Mom yelled, trying to get close to him. But when she reached out to touch him, Michael turned and shoved her hard. Mom, who was 52 at the time and had never been a big woman, stumbled and fell onto the couch. Dad tried to hold Michael by the arms, but my brother, who was now close to 5 feet 7 inches and surprisingly strong, fought back violently. During the struggle, Michael's fist connected with Dad's face, leaving a purple bruise that lasted for weeks. It took 40 minutes for Michael to calm down. When he finally stopped, he collapsed on the floor, exhausted, like he didn't understand what had happened. He looked around the destroyed room. Glass everywhere, furniture knocked around, all of us visibly shaken, with genuine confusion. "Why are you all sad?" he asked, his voice small and childlike again. That night, after Michael went to bed, my parents and I sat around the kitchen table for a conversation we'd been putting off for months. "We can't keep doing this," Dad said, gently touching the bruise on his face. "He's getting bigger than me, and these episodes are happening almost every week." "He doesn't do it on purpose," Mom insisted, always defending Michael. "He can't control it." "I know that, Linda. But what if next time he hurts you bad? What if he hurts Sarah when she's visiting?" The hard truth was that Michael was becoming physically dangerous. Not by choice, but because his brain could no longer regulate his emotions, the way the rest of us took for granted. At school, things were equally challenging. Mrs. Coleman had retired, and Michael was now in 5th grade with Mr. Martinez, a young, well-meaning teacher who just didn't have the training to handle Michael's special needs. He can't sit still during lessons, Mr. Martinez explained during a meeting with my parents. He rocks back and forth, makes strange noises, and when other students try to interact with him, sometimes he reacts aggressively. Athens Elementary, like most rural schools, had limited resources for children with special needs. There was only one school psychologist who split her time between 3 different school districts. The speech therapist only visited twice a week. "We need a full evaluation for Michael," Mr. Martinez said. "But our waiting list is 6 months, and after that, if he qualifies for special services, it could take another 6 months to put a proper plan in place." Meanwhile, Michael was losing more and more academic skills. His handwriting, which used to be careful and readable, became sloppy and hard to make out. His reading ability, which had been advanced for his age, was now 2 years behind 5th grade level. But the most heartbreaking thing was watching him lose the ability to connect with us emotionally. Michael stopped seeking hugs or shows of affection entirely. If we tried to hug him, he'd stiffen up like our touch was painful. Sarah Home. He'd sometimes ask when I visited from Columbus, but his question didn't have the warmth or excitement it used to. It was more like he was checking a fact, the same way he'd ask about the weather. During the summer of 2006, when Michael was 11, we had our first encounter with Ohio's mental health system. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the only child psychiatrist within 150 miles, had her office in Chillicothe, an hour-and-a-half drive from Athens. Dr. Walsh's waiting room was full of families that looked worn out. Kids with various special needs, parents with deep circles under their eyes, older siblings like me who'd taken on responsibilities they shouldn't have had. Michael Mackenzie. The nurse called after 2 hours of waiting. Michael refused to go into the office. He just planted his feet on the waiting room floor and shook his head hard. "No, no, no," he repeated, his voice getting louder. Dr. Walsh, a small woman in her early 40s with graying hair and glasses, came out of her office to meet us in the waiting room. "Sometimes it's easier to start here," she said calmly, pulling up a chair to sit across from us. For the next 45 minutes, Dr. Walsh watched Michael carefully while talking to my parents. Michael rocked in his chair, occasionally making low sounds that were like a mix of humming and moaning. He never made eye contact with Dr. Walsh, not once. "Based on what you've described and what I'm observing, I believe Michael is on the autism spectrum," Dr. Walsh finally said. "Specifically, it appears to be what we call regressive autism or latent autism." Mom started crying quietly. Dad got very quiet, the way he did when he was processing difficult information. "What does this mean for him?" Dad asked. "Will he get better?" Dr. Walsh chose her words carefully. "Autism is a lifelong condition. Michael won't go back to being like he was before. But with the right supports, appropriate therapies, and lots of love and patience, he can learn new ways to communicate and interact with the world." She explained that Michael would need occupational therapy, speech therapy, and possibly medication to help with emotional regulation. She also suggested intensive behavioral therapy. "Where do we get these services?" Mom asked. "That's the tough part," Dr. Walsh admitted. "In the rural area where you live, resources are extremely limited. The nearest speech therapist with autism experience is in Columbus. Intensive behavioral therapy just isn't available in Athens County." She gave us a list of contacts and resources, but when we got home and started making calls, the reality became clear. Nearly everything Michael needed was hours away, or had waiting lists of years. Meanwhile, things at home were going downhill fast. Michael's violent episodes were happening almost daily. He'd broken most of the breakable things in our house. We had to remove mirrors, pictures, and anything that could be used as a weapon during his meltdowns. Dad installed special locks on all the bedrooms so we could lock ourselves in if we had to. We hid knives and other potentially dangerous objects. Our house started looking more like an institution than a family home. The Athens community, a small town where everybody knew everybody, started reacting to our situation in ways that ranged from well-meaning to cruel. At the Methodist church where our family had attended for decades, some folks offered prayers and casseroles. Others whispered about lack of discipline and looked at us with pity or judgment. That Mackenzie family, I heard Mrs. Peterson say to Mrs. Johnson after Sunday service. That boy needs a good whipping, not medical excuses. Mr. Johnson, who worked with Dad at the brick plant, replied, "Tom's a good man. If he says the boy's got medical problems, then he's got medical problems." But not everyone was so understanding. Michael stopped getting invited to birthday parties. Other kids in the neighborhood started crossing the street when they saw him coming. Some parents wouldn't let their children play near our house. School was struggling too. In December 2006, we had an emergency meeting because Michael had pushed a classmate during recess. The boy wasn't hurt bad, but the principal, Mrs. Campbell, was concerned. "We understand Michael has special needs," she said, "but we also have a responsibility to keep all the children safe." They suggested Michael might need a special school. But the nearest special school was in Columbus, and there was no transportation available. Basically, Dad said bitterly after the meeting, they want him gone, but they don't have anywhere to send him. At home, Mom was showing signs of depression. She'd stopped going to the library where she worked because Michael couldn't be left alone, and we couldn't afford specialized babysitters. Dad was working extra shifts at the plant to pay for doctor visits and trips to specialists, which meant Mom was alone with Michael most of the time. "Sarah, I don't know how much longer I can do this," Mom confessed to me one night when I visited during winter break. We were sitting in the kitchen after midnight when Michael had finally fallen asleep after a 3-hour episode. Today, he hit me in the face when I tried to give him a bath. He's almost as tall as me now, and he's getting stronger every day. I love my son more than life itself, but I'm scared of him. It was the first time Mom admitted being afraid of Michael, and it broke my heart because I knew how much it must have cost her to say that. During my college years, I felt constant guilt. I was living a normal college student life. Parties, dating, classes, plans for the future, while my family was falling apart at home. Every time my phone rang, my stomach would tighten, thinking it might be an emergency involving Michael. In March 2007, we made our first 911 call. Michael, now 12 and almost 5 feet 9, had an episode so violent that Dad couldn't handle him alone. Michael had thrown a chair through the living room window and was threatening to throw himself through the broken glass. When the paramedics arrived, they found our traumatized family and a house that looked like it had been hit by a tornado. Michael was curled up in the corner of the room, rocking and humming to himself, completely disconnected from the chaos he'd created. "He needs to be hospitalized," one of the paramedics said. "It's not safe for him or for y'all." But when we got to Athens Regional Hospital, the psychiatrist on duty looked at Michael, who was calm and cooperative at that moment, and said he didn't see signs of immediate danger. "Isolated behavioral episodes aren't grounds for admission," he explained, "unless he's an immediate threat to himself or others at the time of evaluation." We went home that night without any additional help, knowing the next episode was inevitable. Over the following years, this pattern repeated several times. Michael would have violent episodes that forced us to call for emergency help, but by the time professionals arrived, he'd be calm, leaving our family looking dramatic or like we were exaggerating. It's like he knows when strangers are around, Dad observed bitterly after our fourth trip to the emergency room. Our family's social isolation deepened. We stopped going to restaurants, movies, or anywhere public because we couldn't predict when Michael would have an episode. We stopped having visitors because we couldn't guarantee a safe environment. Our home became a loving prison where all of us were doing our best to care for someone we loved, but who had become unpredictable and sometimes dangerous. During this period, I started understanding that Michael's autism wasn't just about him. It was about our whole family learning to navigate a world that didn't have adequate resources, a community that didn't understand, and a healthcare system that was poorly equipped to help us, and Michael. Michael was lost somewhere inside his own mind, fighting demons we couldn't see or understand, desperately trying to communicate with us in ways we didn't know how to interpret. By 2009, when Michael was 14, our family had become expert at navigating a system that seemed designed to frustrate us at every turn. We had a thick folder full of forms, medical reports, educational plans, and insurance denials, physical evidence of our struggle to get adequate help for Michael. Our first big battle was with the school district. Michael had been officially diagnosed with autism, which theoretically qualified him for special education services under federal law. But the reality of implementing those services in a small rural school was completely different from the theory. "We don't have an autism program here," the new principal, Mrs. Williams, explained during an IEP Individualized Education Program meeting in August. Our special education specialist deals mainly with learning disabilities and mild intellectual disabilities. The specialist was actually Mrs. Thompson, a teacher who'd taken a 40-hour online course in special education over the summer. She was well-meaning, but clearly in over her head. Michael needs a structured environment with predictable routines and communication support, I argued. I'd spent years researching autism and knew Michael's educational rights better than anyone in that room. "We could try creating a quiet area for him in the back of the classroom," Mrs. Thompson suggested, "and maybe we could give him extra time to finish his assignments." "That's not nearly enough," Dad said, his voice tight. "He needs speech therapy, occupational therapy, and social skills training." "We understand, Mr. Mackenzie," Mrs. Williams replied, "but we just don't have the resources. The district budget is stretched thin, and hiring specialized therapists would cost more than we can afford." The meeting lasted 3 hours and resulted in an IEP that was full of vague language and promises everyone knew would be hard to keep. Michael would receive modified educational support and behavioral accommodations as needed, terms that didn't mean anything specific. Meanwhile, we were trying to navigate the state's mental health system. Dr. Walsh had moved to Cleveland, leaving us without a local psychiatrist. The nearest replacement was in Columbus, and appointments had to be scheduled 3 months out. In September, Michael had his scariest episode yet. It was a Thursday afternoon, and I was home visiting for my 23rd birthday. Michael had been relatively calm all day, but during supper, something switched. It started when Dad asked if Michael wanted more mashed potatoes. Instead of answering, Michael looked around the table with total confusion, like he didn't recognize where he was or who we were. "Michael," Mom said softly. "You okay, honey?" Then Michael started screaming. Not from anger this time, but from genuine terror. He jumped up from his chair and started running through the house, yelling, "No, no, no," like he was running from something only he could see. When Dad tried to calm him down, Michael shoved him so hard that Dad hit the wall and fell to the floor. Then Michael ran to the kitchen and started opening all the cabinets, throwing dishes and pans on the floor. Where? He was yelling, obviously looking for something, but unable to tell us what. We called 911 again. This time, when the paramedics got there, Michael was still in crisis. It took 4 people to hold him safely, while they gave him a sedative. At the hospital, the psychiatrist on duty, Dr. Rodriguez, finally took our situation seriously. "This family needs immediate help," he said after examining Michael and talking to us. "This young man is clearly in distress, and y'all are in an unsustainable situation." Dr. Rodriguez connected us with a social worker named Jennifer Maple, who specialized in families with autistic children. Jennifer was the first professional who really got our situation. "Y'all are living in what I call a resource desert," she explained during our first meeting. Rural families with severely autistic children often get stuck between lack of local services and inability to access distant services. Jennifer helped us apply for several state programs. Ohio's waiver program could provide funding for in-home care and respite services. But the waiting list was 3 years. 3 years, Mom repeated, incredulous. He could seriously hurt us in 3 years, or hurt himself. "I understand," Jennifer said compassionately. "Let's see if we can speed up the process due to the severity of the situation." Meanwhile, we started experimenting with medications. Dr. Rodriguez prescribed risperidone to help with Michael's aggression. The side effects were immediate and devastating. Michael, who'd already lost so much of his personality, became completely zombie-like. He slept 14 hours a day, and when he was awake, he moved like he was underwater. His small amount of remaining speech disappeared completely. "At least he's not being violent," Dad said hesitantly, after a week on the medication. "But he's not living either," I replied. "Look at him, Dad. It's like he's not even here." We stopped the risperidone and tried several other medications over the following months. Olanzapine made Michael gain 45 pounds in 2 months. Aripiprazole gave him hand tremors. Lithium required weekly blood tests that became an epic battle every time. Each new medication required weeks to show effects, and if it didn't work, more weeks to get out of his system before we tried something else. Michael became a living laboratory, and we were desperate to find something that would help him without destroying what was left of his personality. During this time, we discovered the devastating financial cost of severe autism. Our medical appointments cost $300 each, and we were going to Columbus at least twice a month. Gas, lost work time, and medications that our basic insurance didn't cover quickly drained our savings. Dad started working weekends at Mr. Henderson's farm to make extra money. Mom went back to work part-time at the library, but could only work when I or Dad were home to stay with Michael. "We're drowning," Dad said one night, looking at a pile of medical bills. "I don't know how families with fewer resources than ours manage this." The truth was that many didn't. Jennifer Maple told us about families who'd been forced to surrender custody of their autistic children to the state, because it was the only way to get adequate care. "The system is broken," she admitted. Families are forced to become destitute or give up their children to get the services that should be available from the start. In 2010, we finally got a spot in the respite care program, 3 hours per week when a trained aide would stay with Michael, allowing the rest of the family some normalcy. Our first aide was Sharon, a 50-year-old woman who'd worked with adults with developmental disabilities. She lasted 2 weeks. Michael shoved her during an episode, and she decided she wasn't comfortable with his level of aggression. The second aide, Marcus, was a young, athletic man we thought could handle Michael physically. He lasted a month before admitting he was in over his head. "He's just too strong," Marcus explained. "And when he goes into crisis mode, it's like he becomes a completely different person. I don't feel safe." Finding caregivers willing and able to work with Michael became nearly impossible. The home care agency finally told us they couldn't provide services to our family anymore. "We're sorry," the supervisor explained, "but we simply don't have staff trained to handle aggression at this level." So we were back to square one. Our family alone, trying to care for Michael 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, with no break or help. The emotional costs were becoming as devastating as the financial ones. Mom developed severe anxiety and started taking antidepressants. Dad started drinking more than usual after work. Not a lot, but enough for me to notice. I felt guilty for having a normal life. I was finishing college, had a serious boyfriend, plans for the future. But every time I came home, I saw what Michael was costing my parents, and felt terrible for not being there to help. "You need to live your life," Mom always said. "We won't let this destroy your future too." But how could I live a normal life, knowing my family was struggling every day just to survive? The Athens community reacted to our situation in various ways. The Methodist Church organized some meal trains for us, which helped. But there were also whispers about why we didn't just institutionalize Michael, as if there were facilities ready to take him. The truth was that facilities for children and teens with severe autism were rare and expensive as all get out. The nearest facility that might be appropriate for Michael was in Indiana and cost $8,000 a month, more than our family's annual income. "The system is designed for families like ours to fail," I wrote in my diary during this period. "It's not incompetence. It's intentional design. They know that if they make it impossible enough, families will give up and the state won't have to pay for expensive services." In 2011, when Michael turned 16, our situation reached a new crisis. Michael was now almost 6 feet tall and weighed over 200 pounds. During one episode, he broke Dad's nose with an unintentional punch. "We can't do this anymore," Dad said at the hospital while waiting for an X-ray. "He's going to kill us by accident, or we're going to end up hurting him trying to defend ourselves." It was then that we started seriously exploring residential care for Michael. Not because we didn't love him, but because loving him meant admitting that his needs had outgrown our ability to meet them safely at home. Michael turned 30 this past March, and as I tell this story, he's sitting in my parents' living room, gently rocking and humming a tune only he knows. He's 6'1" now, and weighs almost 260 pounds. 10 inches taller than me, and 100 pounds heavier. Just like I said at the beginning, these last 10 years have been about acceptance and adaptation. Not acceptance of defeat, but acceptance of the reality of who Michael is now, and how our family can continue loving him the best way possible within the limited resources we have. In 2015, when Michael turned 20, we finally got a spot in the state waiver program. This gave us access to 20 hours per week of home care and $500 monthly for house modifications. It was a huge relief, but it also came 15 years too late. We used the funding to turn the basement into a semi-independent apartment for Michael. We installed padding on the walls, removed anything that could be broken or used as a weapon, and created a safe, comfortable space for him. Michael still doesn't talk. On good days, he'll say, "Mama," or "water," single words he uses to communicate basic needs. But most communication now is through gestures, sounds, and behavioral cues we've learned to interpret over the years. He's developed some routines that bring him comfort. Every morning, he arranges a set of toy cars in a perfect line. If anyone messes with the cars, he gets visibly upset until he can reorganize them. It's an echo of the child who used to organize his toys. But now, it's more compulsive, more necessary for his emotional regulation. Michael still has violent episodes, but they're less frequent now. Maybe once a month, instead of daily. Part of this might be medication. He's on a low dose of quetiapine that seems to help. Part might be that we've learned to better recognize his triggers and create an environment that minimizes stress. Dad, who's now 68, has developed arthritis in his hands and back, partly from years of physically restraining Michael during episodes. Mom, 65, has chronic anxiety that requires medication, and admits that some days she's afraid to be alone with Michael. "I love my son," she told me last week, "but I don't want to die because I can't handle him physically anymore." It's a devastatingly honest admission that reflects the reality millions of aging parents of adults with disabilities face. What happens when the caregivers get older, more fragile, less able to provide care? Our society still hasn't developed adequate answers to this question. I came back to our town after college to help. I work remotely as a graphic designer, which gives me flexibility to be available when my parents need breaks. My college boyfriend, Jake, initially had trouble understanding why I chose to limit my career opportunities to stay close to home. "You're sacrificing your life for someone who doesn't even always recognize you," he said during a fight that ended our relationship. "He's my brother," I replied. "And some days he does recognize me." Those moments of recognition are rare but precious. Last month, I was helping Michael with lunch when he looked directly into my eyes, something he rarely does, and said, "Sawa," clear as day. It was the first time in years he'd said my name. I started crying right there at the kitchen table. Michael seemed concerned and gently touched my hand. For a moment, I saw a flash of the old Michael, empathetic, caring, wanting to comfort someone he loved. "I'm okay," I told him. "I'm just happy." He didn't understand the words, but seemed to get the emotion. He kept his hand on mine for several minutes, the longest physical contact we'd had in years. Michael's daily routine now is highly structured. He wakes up at exactly 7:30 every day, regardless of weekends or holidays. He eats the same breakfast oatmeal with brown sugar, watches the same TV shows, old cartoons from the 80s that somehow still calm him, and spends hours organizing and reorganizing various objects. We've learned to work with his need for routine instead of fighting against it. On days when something disrupts his schedule, a doctor's appointment, an unexpected visitor, even bad weather, we know to prepare for possible meltdowns and plan accordingly. Michael's relationship with other people is minimal. He tolerates our immediate family, but strangers make him anxious. When new caregivers come to the house, it takes weeks or months for him to accept their presence without getting agitated. The isolation is one of the hardest parts. Other families in our community have moved on. Their children grew up, got married, had kids. Meanwhile, our family life remains frozen in a permanent state of vigilance and adaptation. We don't go to restaurants. We don't take vacations. We don't have dinner parties or holiday gatherings. Our social life revolves entirely around Michael's needs and limitations. Sometimes I wonder what our lives would have been like. Mom said recently, looking out the window as neighbors gathered for a backyard barbecue we couldn't attend. "Different," I replied, "but not necessarily better. We love differently now, more deeply, more consciously." It's true, though it took years to realize. Caring for Michael has taught our family about a love that doesn't depend on reciprocity. We love him not for what he gives us back, but for who he is, our son, brother, family member who deserves care and dignity regardless of his abilities. But there are darker truths I need to share too. Sometimes, usually in the middle of the night after a particularly hard day, I catch myself thinking about what will happen when Mom and Dad get too old to care for Michael. What happens when I'm his only caregiver? What if I get sick, get hurt, or can't continue? Group homes for adults with severe autism in Ohio have waiting lists that stretch for years. Many are understaffed and poorly equipped to handle aggressive behaviors. Stories about abuse in institutions are common enough to scare any family. I pray every night to die before Michael, Mom confessed to me last year, because I can't stand the thought of him being alone in the world without people who love him. It's a terrible thing for any parent to think, but it's the reality for thousands of families dealing with severe developmental disabilities. There's also financial stress that never ends. Even with state assistance, caring for Michael costs our family approximately $2,000 per month in expenses not covered by insurance or programs. Special foods, because he'll only eat certain textures. Replacement for items he breaks during episodes. Doctor visits. Medications. Transportation to specialists who are always hours away. Dad should retire next year, but he can't afford to stop working. His pension and Social Security won't cover Michael's ongoing care costs, especially when combined with their own age-related medical expenses. Sometimes I feel guilty for admitting how hard this is. There are families dealing with cancer, war, poverty, and so many devastating challenges. And some people might read this and think we're complaining about caring for a person with a disability. But I believe it's important to be honest about the reality of long-term caregiving when society provides inadequate support. It's not about loving less. It's about acknowledging that love alone doesn't solve systemic problems. Michael's case represents what Dr. Walsh once called complex autism, significant intellectual disability combined with severe behavioral challenges. He's not a person who will someday live independently, hold a job, or navigate social situations without assistance. His needs will require 24-hour supervision for the rest of his life. And yet, there are moments, brief, precious moments, when I see glimpses of who he might have been. Last week, he spent an hour gently playing with the neighbor's new puppy. His face was relaxed, almost smiling, and his movements were careful and deliberate. He would have been good with animals, I thought, watching him. Maybe would have been a veterinarian or worked at a zoo. It's dangerous to think like that too often. Imagining alternate lives, different outcomes. But occasionally allowing yourself to grieve what might have been is part of accepting what really is. If you've come this far with me on this journey, you understand that this isn't a story with a happy ending in the traditional sense. Michael isn't going to wake up tomorrow talking again. He's not suddenly going to develop independence or become the person we imagined he'd be when he was born. But that doesn't mean our story is a hopeless tragedy. Today's a typical fall Tuesday in Athens County. The oak leaves are golden, just like they were in those childhood autumns when Michael and I collected the prettiest ones to make collages. As I record this story for y'all, I can hear Michael in his basement space, humming softly while arranging his toy cars in the perfect order that only he understands. Mom, now 69, is in the kitchen making the pumpkin soup we discovered is one of the few things that can still calm Michael when he's agitated. Her hands, marked by arthritis, developed after years of physically restraining him during crises. Work with the patience only mothers know how to have. Dad, at 72, is out in the yard checking the safety locks he installed on all the windows. His movements are slower now, his back aches constantly, but he's never stopped adapting our home to keep Michael safe. Always thinking one step ahead, always protecting. We're not a perfect family. We don't have all the answers. We're not heroes or martyrs. We're just ordinary folks who learn to love in a way we never imagined possible. Over these 23 years since Michael started changing, our family has discovered that hope doesn't always look like healing. Sometimes hope looks like a day without violent episodes. Sometimes it looks like Michael eating a whole meal without resistance. Sometimes it looks like getting a full night's sleep, knowing he's safe and calm. Last week, something happened that I want to share with y'all. I was having one of those impossible days we all know. Work was stressful. I'd argued with Mom about the best way to handle a new behavior of Michael's. And I felt completely overwhelmed by the constant weight of responsibility. I sat in my car in our driveway and cried. I cried for the life I thought I'd have. I cried for the brother I lost. I cried for the guilt of sometimes wishing I was anywhere but there. I cried because at 38, I'd never lived alone, never put my own dreams first, never had the freedom to just be Sarah, without being the sister who takes care of Michael. When I finally dried my tears and went inside, Michael was standing in the living room. He was holding one of his favorite cars, a red 1967 Mustang he'd been organizing religiously every day for years. Our eyes met. And y'all have to understand, direct eye contact with Michael is rare and precious. For a moment, those green eyes I remembered from childhood seemed to really see me, recognize me not just as a familiar presence, but as Sarah, his sister, who'd always been there. Then he did something extraordinary. He walked over to me and held out the red car. To anyone watching, it would have just been a simple gesture. But to me, in that moment, it was like Michael was saying, "Sarah, I see you're sad. This car brings me comfort every day. Maybe it can help you too." I took the car with shaking hands and said, "Thank you, Michael. I love you so much." He didn't respond with words. He rarely speaks now, except for single words like mama or water. But he didn't pull away when I gently touched his shoulder. We stood there for maybe 5 minutes, just existing in the same space, sharing a moment of connection that reminded me why this life, as hard as it is, still has deep meaning. Then Michael went back to his routines, and I kept that red car on my work desk, where it sits to this day. On hard days, I look at it and remember that love doesn't need to be expressed in words to be real. Over these years, caring for Michael, our family has learned lessons I want to share with y'all, especially if you're living something similar. First lesson: accept help, even when it's not perfect. For years, we tried to do everything ourselves, because we thought nobody else could understand Michael's specific needs. Or because we were ashamed for people to see how hard our situation really was. But when we finally started accepting offers of help, even if it was just neighbor Mrs. Henderson bringing a casserole when she knew we'd had a rough week, or the pastor staying with Michael for 2 hours so we could go to the grocery store together, we discovered that these small breaks saved our sanity. Second lesson: fight fiercely, but pick your battles. The system for families like ours is fundamentally broken. Y'all are going to have to fight for every service, every accommodation, every crumb of assistance. But if you try to fight all the battles at once, you'll wear yourselves out completely. Learn to identify which fights are absolutely essential and which can be delayed or abandoned. Sometimes accepting a 70% adequate solution is better than spending 2 years fighting for a 100% perfect solution that may never come. Third lesson: find your tribe, even if it's small. Other families dealing with severe autism understand things that even the dearest, most well-meaning friends never will. They understand why you cancel plans at the last minute. They understand why you can't travel. They understand the isolation, the exhaustion, and also the guilt that comes with wishing things were different. I found my community online first. Forums for moms and siblings of people with severe autism. Then I met some local families through support groups. These connections saved my emotional life more than once. Fourth lesson: take care of yourselves without guilt. I know that sounds, and I know how hard it is in practice. Caregivers live with constant guilt about spending time or energy on themselves when their loved one's needs are so enormous. But you can't give what you don't have. Therapy isn't a luxury. It's a necessity. Medication for anxiety or depression isn't weakness. It's a survival tool. Hobbies that bring joy. Relationships that don't revolve around caregiving. Time alone to breathe. All of this is essential. Fifth lesson: it's okay to grieve while you also celebrate. Cry for the child who might have been. Cry for the plans that changed. Cry for the dreams that became impossible. That grief is valid and necessary. But also recognize the strengths you've developed, the depth of love you've discovered, the resilience you've built. Recognize that you've become people capable of loving without expectation of reciprocity, of finding joy in achievements others might not notice. Both truths, the loss and the growth, can exist in the same heart at the same time. Michael has taught me something the autism community calls presuming competence, assuming that people with autism understand more than they can express. Even though Michael can't tell me what he's thinking or feeling most of the time. I believe deeply that he knows he's loved, that he's safe, that he has value exactly as he is. Last night, when I was helping Michael with supper, he did something that hadn't happened in months. After he finished eating, he looked directly at me and put his hand over mine for a few seconds. He didn't say anything, but in those green eyes I saw a flash of something. Recognition, maybe gratitude, definitely connection. It might have been coincidence. It might have just been a random gesture. But to me, it was Michael reminding me that he's still in there, somewhere deep inside that mind that works so differently from ours. These are the small things where we find hope. Not in miraculous cures or complete recoveries that movies like to show, but in fleeting moments of connection that remind us that love doesn't disappear. It just transforms. To all the families listening to this, who are living versions of our story families, in small towns, who can't access the services they need. Families who've watched their children regress, without understanding why. Families who love deeply, but struggle daily to provide care that exceeds their resources. You're not alone. If you know a family dealing with severe autism, offer specific help. Instead of saying, "Let me know if you need anything," say, "Can I bring supper on Thursday?" Or "Can I stay with your child for 2 hours on Saturday, so y'all can go out together?" If you work in education, healthcare, or social services, please fight for better resources for families like ours. Push for adequate training, real funding, and programs that meet actual needs, instead of just checking bureaucratic boxes. And if you're a family just starting this journey, if you have a child who's regressing, who's losing skills they once had, who's becoming aggressive or withdrawing, please know you're not alone. The road ahead might be completely different from what you imagined, but it can still be a road full of love, growth, and unexpected moments of beauty. Michael is 32 now. He'll always need 24-hour care. His future is uncertain. especially as my parents age. There are difficult conversations we'll have to have soon about long-term care. But today, right now, he's safe. Today, he's deeply loved. Today, he arranged his cars in a perfect line and seemed genuinely content with his small, carefully ordered world. Regressive autism taught me something terrifying: that development isn't always linear, that skills can disappear overnight, that the child you know can change in unimaginable ways. But it also taught me that true love doesn't depend on reciprocity, that caregiving can be a form of prayer, that small moments of connection can sustain you through years of difficulty. Michael may have lost most of his words, but he taught me an entirely new language: the language of gentle gestures, shared silences, love that persists even when everything else changes. Our house in Athens County might not be perfect. Our family might be tired, financially stretched, and sometimes desperate. But we're also a family that's learned to find joy in achievements others might not notice. An unexpected smile, a full night's sleep, a voluntary hug that happens maybe once a year but's worth 1,000. We've learned that strength isn't never breaking. Strength is allowing yourself to break and still choosing to continue. That family isn't just people who share DNA. It's people who choose to stay, especially when it gets hard. If you're listening to this and recognizing your own story, I want you to know, you're stronger than you imagine. You're capable of more love than you knew existed inside you. And please, don't ever forget, you're not walking this road alone. In Athens County, among the rolling hills of Ohio where I grew up, our family continues. We love, we care. We find hope in small things. And that, imperfect as it is enough. It's more than enough. It's sacred. Thanks for coming along with me on this true story. It represents not just my family's journey, but thousands of families around the world living similar realities. If this story touched your heart, if it changed your perspective on autism, or if it helped you feel less alone in your own journey, please like the video, share it, and subscribe to the channel. It'll surely help families who are desperately looking to know they're not alone. Until the next story, remember, in the small things, we find the greatest hopes.